Hi, everyone. My name is David Bradshaw. I'm the Assistant Director of the Graduate Center, a unit of the Graduate College that focuses on professional development and interdisciplinary collaboration and networking across all of graduate education. We are one of the co-hosts of the ABD to PhD dissertation writing workshop series. The other co-hosts are our facilitator today, Dr. Leslie DuPont, who is the writing coach in the College of Nursing, as well as the Think Tank Writing Center is another co-host, and the Graduate and Professional Student Council. And the Writing Skills Improvement Program is one of the sponsors of our event as well, a longtime partner in creating a lot of the content, the initial content anyway. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. DuPont. She may say a little bit more about herself, but there's a lot to cover today, and I look forward to supporting all of you in this workshop.
Great. Thanks so much, David. I'll just say a couple of things quickly. You may all be wondering why the writing coach of the College of Nursing is presenting this workshop, but I was actually the Graduate Writing Institute coordinator at the Writing Skills Improvement Program before this current position. And that's how we got involved working with David. We touched base with each other and with the then president of the GPSC and got these going about, 6 years ago now, 5-6 years ago. And we have learned a lot over time. My PhD is in rhetoric, composition, and the teaching of English. So I have for several decades now been teaching writing and humanities, mostly writing across the disciplines. So that's kind of how I ended up where I am now. And we will take this one step at a time. So with no further ado, I do want to invite y'all, though, to feel free to ask questions. You can raise your hand in your, using the reactions function. You can post a question to chat or just unmute and ask your question that way. Any of those options are fine. And we'll also have room for questions at the end. Okay, so welcome to Literature Review 1.0, the dissertation edition. And can I get a quick hands up or yes or thumbs up? How many of you are working on your dissertations or just about to work on your dissertations at this point? Let's see. So we've got, Jingyi, Maria, and Elisa, Alessandra, Sophie. Okay, we've got quite a few of you. And Brianna, good. Okay, and Allison, how many of you are working on your master's degrees and but know that you're looking forward to a dissertation at some point, to a doctoral program? Is there anyone here working on their master's program at this point? Okay, and then is there anyone who's in your doctoral program, but maybe at a little earlier point? Okay, so it looks like pretty much we're working with all but dissertated or very close to that folks tonight. So, okay. Oh, I see 2 hands raised. All right. So, that might have just been for the vote. Okay. So if we did miss you, though, just unmute and feel free to speak up. So with no further ado, would somebody be willing to read the Arizona Land Acknowledgement Statement? Could I have someone volunteer to do that?
I'll do it.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah.
We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education, through education offerings, partnerships, and community service.
Thank you so much. Okay, so just a brief overview of our agenda. It looks jam-packed, but actually the last two are just like they look, a list of resources, and then if anyone has additional questions. And the jam sessions are going to be pretty short and quick. So we're going to have a quick Jamboard. When I say jam session, we're using the Jamboard, and I am going to put in the chat now a link to, this is an open Jamboard. So if you click on the link, as long as you log in, you may not even need to, but if you log in with your U of A email, and you might have to sign in through your U of A sign-in page, and then you don't have to do anything yet, but we're going to start with that in a few minutes. We're then going to look at some literature review structures and also talk about varying definitions of what reviewing the literature versus a literature review might mean. We're going to look at a couple of examples and then jump into a small group activity. And I've got several sample dissertations recently completed and one sample master's thesis. They're different, written in different ways. So I will set up a small group for each one of those, and you can join the one that you would prefer to join. We'll then talk a little bit about ways backing up from the literature, the sort of literature review chapter or section you might write in a piece of writing. Back up a little bit to how you start organizing your sources and notes to begin with. And here we'll talk about using what's called a matrix. You may have also heard them referred to as literature review tables or charts, matrices. There's several different words for them. We'll then do another quick brainstorming jam session 2 and have a quick wrap up. So we're going to go on to jam session 1 right now, and I'm going to shift my share for a minute to our Jamboard. And I'm not looking for a magic answer. The question is, how would you describe a literature review? If you have no idea, or you're taking a best guess, that's absolutely fine to say that. This is, just answer honestly from wherever you are at this point. And we'll give you another minute or so. We're going to keep this pretty quick. You guys are going wild, though. This is great. Here's what we're starting to get. A review of current and historical literature available, an overview or brief introduction of secondary studies that form the foundation of my study, but also need to be further examined, a state of the field summary, reviewing the past literature related to my current study and synthesizing, materials, i.e. literature that relate to the author's research. The materials are combined and synthesized into cohesive narrative, thus a survey of the literature. It informs why you make certain decisions. Used as an overview of the research that has been done in the field or fields you are working in, and is a place where you gather and synthesize literature that informs your overarching research question and aims. All of these are correct. So basically, the literature, as it looks like you all know, is the published research out there. And what you're doing is you are using your research question, aims, focus to the what you want to do in a study. If you're doing a primary research study, whatever it is, you're using that to guide what literature you search for, how you focus you search, and then what you focus on when you're reading and taking notes on the literature. Over here, where we have a brief introduction or overview of secondary studies. So secondary studies could be considered for your purposes. You might be the primary researcher or investigator for your particular research project. And then other research that you read could be considered secondary studies. It could also be considered, other literature could also be considered primary studies if the authors are writing about their own work, their own particular research study. So, but at what you're doing is you're looking at the literature, you're starting a broad search and narrowing it down, using again your particular research question to focus it, and then taking a look at what has been done, what gaps might exist, where more research might be useful, and synthesizing, which is something we'll talk more about in the spring. What that means is you're starting to identify patterns, themes, major findings, perspectives, debates, whatever, that might cross over multiple literature, so that you multiple sources, so that you're starting to then say, oh, okay, so several researchers have found this, and you state that finding and it's like one synthesized statement rather than going researcher by researcher. Generally, a literature review, a well-crafted one, is not it's not just a laundry list of who did what. You're thinking more in terms of what themes or patterns am I, categorical points am I pulling out of the literature I'm looking at, and I'm going to use those to organize my literature review. We'll look at that in a minute too. So, archived original materials, yes, those are considered primary sources. And it also depends on what your program is. If you, for instance, are in history, primary sources would be things like diaries, letters, maps, and so forth. And anything written about them or interpreting them would all be secondary. It's a secondary study. In literature, that's pretty much how we do it too. In humanities, a lot, like we'll look at a primary source, a work of literature, for instance, and we will interpret it. We will discuss it through the lens of maybe one or two theoretical frameworks or ways of applying it or something. So all of those are secondary studies. However, if you're in the sciences and often social sciences, if you are looking at sources that are studies reported on by the people who conducted them, the primary investigators, principal investigators, those are primary studies or primary research. Secondary might be something like what's called a systematic review, where it's a very, very structured, formal process, extensive, exhaustive process of narrowing a body of research down to a very focused group, and then synthesizing what you see, synthesizing the findings, the data, and so forth. But what you're doing is that kind of a review is a secondary study. Does that make sense? Or does anyone have questions about that? And you're very welcome, Maria. Okay, jump in if you consider, think of some other questions. In the meantime, I'm going to shift my share back to the PowerPoint and move us on to some structures that you might see literature reviews fall under. Many of you might have heard of the, kind of traditional 5-chapter dissertation. where you have an introduction, a literature review, and so forth. And then you might have a methods and results and discussion conclusion chapter. You might also have an introduction and a literature review, and then say a chapter on theoretical frameworks, on applications of your particular question, and a conclusion. There are also dissertations that will have more than 5 chapters. But in the standard traditional chapter dissertation, usually chapter 2 is dedicated to reviewing the literature. And so it's kind of it's a focused, careful look at what research has already been done, excuse me, as it relates to your research question. There are also manuscript dissertations, sometimes called like a 3-article dissertation. And a lot of these will have potentially either like an overarching introduction chapter that might even precede chapter 1 or act as chapter 1, which kind of lays out the structure of the dissertation, which is pretty standard for dissertation introduction, but might also do a little bit of focused review of central concepts or findings in the particular area of study. And then the rest of the, any other literature review might be included in individual either chapters or other sections, such as appendices of the dissertation manuscript. And those appendices will often be separately published articles. And some of you might be in programs where you're expected to publish, have at least one article published, one article accepted for publication, and one article getting ready to send to a journal. And those become separate chapters or appendices of your manuscript. And the rest of the manuscript is sort of, again, that sort of overarching introduction and overarching conclusion, and perhaps some other maybe discussion of general methods used or something like that. So also for instance, especially in the humanities, history, and literature, you might find literature reviews embedded throughout. This is sort of what Paul, you were alluding to, but also others will, you'll see sort of references to and uses of sources throughout the entire dissertation manuscript for, a variety of reasons. So these are some of the basic structures that you'll see. There's also another meaning or definition of literature review, and that is the process when you have sort of narrowed down your initial search of sources to a manageable number of the most relevant sources. And then you take a closer look at these. You start really looking at, the abstracts, and then the introductions and various sections of these articles to see if they are indeed going to be useful for you for one purpose or another. As you do this, you are taking notes in. And this is one way to do it. There are other ways to do it, but often you'll be taking notes in a grid or matrix, table, chart. It's all the same, but it's a literature review matrix. And you set it up and organize it in a way that works best for you. So we'll talk about that and look at some examples of that a little later. So let's look at a couple of exemplars. First, I want to share with you 2 examples that, here, let me see. I want to back up just a minute. 2 examples that I'd like to discuss with you, and please feel free to jump in with questions as you see fit. So give me just a second here. I'm going to stop my share because I need to pull up these. My apologies. Okay. All right, perfect. Okay, I'm going to go back to share. And okay. What's going on here? Let me try that again. Something happened with my share. Oh, okay. I think we're good. Can you see the geosciences dissertation? It starts lithospheric structure of the Ecuadorian orogenic system and event location, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, yes. Okay, great. Thank you all. All right, so we're going to start with this one. And I've annotated it a little bit, so I've got some bookmarks in here. And the reason I want to start with this one is it is more of the articles as appendices kind of approach. And so it can sometimes be a little difficult if you're doing this kind of, or something similar to this kind of dissertation. It can sometimes be a little confusing to figure out what the literature review is, because there isn't really a section called literature review. So we're going to first look at the table of contents. And we'll see that it's pretty standard to start with a list of figures, abstract, and introduction. But then we go into a summary of work, figures, and references. Then we move into specific appendices, and there are several appendices. Each one of these is a separate article that the writer of the dissertation co-authored with some of their committee members and other colleagues, other peers in the field, but is first author on. So do not worry if you have no idea what the content is about, because that's not what we're looking at. What we're looking at is structure. So we're first going to go to the actual introduction of the dissertation itself, the big cheese introduction. And so what I want you to think about is it starts out talking about earthquake behavior, seismic signals, volcanic eruptions, and the general field of seismology has a broad range of applications, from studying the source properties that generate seismic signals to using those waves to study the seismic structure of the Earth at a wide variety of scales. Okay, and then in this dissertation, I use seismic data. And the reason I'm reading this to you will become clear in a minute. I use seismic data there it is, together with geologic and geophysical data to address a variety of geophysical problems. Okay, as we scroll down, the author starts talking about various studies that they have conducted and written about, and refers to the appendices where these studies are, refers to data sets and where to find them. So what we're going to get in terms of a literature review is a lot of discussion about data and studies that have used that data. And here's where, and also some identification of gaps in the literature or in the research. And so what I'm doing here with my little comments is, adding, like here I'm writing gaps. So if you see a phrase like despite many studies, it's, if you see despite, okay, so what they're saying is even though there are many studies, there's going to be a but somewhere. Something's going to be missing. And sure enough, this specific area that the author is looking into is not fully understood. So when you see phrases like not fully understood, this is the identification of a gap. So one of the things I highly recommend is that you look, and I'll give you the campus repository hyperlink, but we have a repository of completed dissertations through our campus library. Look at the ones that are the most recent from your program, your college, and if you can find ones that have your committee chair or another committee member on those committees, that can be helpful also. So as you are looking through trying to identify what a literature review, you want to look for language like this. So here's another phrase: many factors have been considered. So when I see this, that tells me, especially have been considered, that there's references to studies. And sure enough, this is an example of synthesis where several studies might have looked at some of these factors, and the studies are listed together in the in-text citation. So when we see a phrase like that, critical in understanding, et cetera, these are phrases related to research studies. We then see some examples of studies, or things that have been focused on, factors that have been focused on, such as presence of fluids or sediments. A phrase have been suggested, has been attributed to. These are also phrases that indicate other studies, other work, other research being reviewed. So this is actually, it's part of the overall introduction, but it is acting as a literature review. It's identifying central data that has been gathered, particularly in relation to the overall focus for this dissertation. It is looking at factors, elements that come out of that data. It is looking at various studies that have been done and interpretations that have been suggested from these studies. And it's also identifying gaps. Here's another identified gaps. Despite, here's that word again. You don't have to use despite, but that's a good signal word that a gap is coming up. Despite the importance of the overwriting plate to the megathrust system, it being the overwriting plate, the importance rather of that plate has received less attention than the downgoing plate properties. Again, I have no idea what I just said. I just know that if I were in this field, I would recognize that, okay, this person is identifying a gap that needs more attention. So this is another important part of a literature review. Okay. And again, you're now going to see a lot of references to collected data. And that was, in the different types of data that were mentioned at the beginning of the introduction, references to studies, and it's going to go on like that as it also introduces the various articles in the appendices. Okay, and what they do. So kind of like any introduction to a dissertation, this chapter does this chapter does that. Here it's this appendix or article focuses on this one focuses on that. But the difference here is that the references to collected data and research on that, using that data, are continuing to be interwoven into this introduction. So the overall introduction acts as an overall, fairly brief, but overall review of the literature. Does that make sense before we go into a specific article and seeing what they do there? Okay. So we're here, this section starts shifting to comparisons of various kinds of data collection and analysis, in other words, methods used, but there is still reference to studies and data that have been used in those studies. Okay, but then it starts narrowing the focus to the author's specific co-authored studies. So let's look at one of these. This is Appendix or Article A, and it's literally going to be called Appendix A. This is the title of the article. These are the co-authors with the dissertation writer as first author. And these are all the author attributions, author background information. A brief summary. This is not going to show up in every kind of dissertation. It's acting basically as an abstract for this article. You can kind of think of it that way, followed by keywords. The introduction of the article again goes into collected data and where researchers have been encouraged to look when discovering this or learning about this data. Okay, so a lot of this data is related to volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. Again, though, we see has been previously attributed to. This is a sign that we're going to also be mentioning what has already been done in the literature. Okay, so these are some of the studies that have been done using that data or interpreting that data. Again, recent studies have suggested many factors contribute. And again, references to other studies. So these references, this is another kind of mini literature review beginning this article. And you'll see this a lot in a lot of science articles, that a shorter literature review is embedded in the introduction to that article. You might also see a separate introduction, then review of literature, but quite often they're conflated, they're blended. So the reason I'm showing you this is some of you may be setting up dissertations that look kind of like this one, and I want you to see how literature reviews can get structured and be used in this kind of structure. We're going to look at more of a traditional chapter dissertation in just a minute, but I again want to do a quick check. Does anyone have any questions or comments, anything they want to even add to my discussion?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So when you're establishing your theoretical framework, I've seen ones that are very brief, but I've also seen ones that have a little bit more literature establishing why that framework is being used. Mm-hmm. So how much do you generally need to do as far as literature, like when you're talking about your framework?
Yes, usually the way I've seen that done is that it's a great question, is the theoretical framework discussion will often be in a separate chapter, and more literature will be pulled in. And this is a great example too of the kinds of dissertations and fields where sort of various uses of literature or reviews of literature are woven in more broadly throughout a document. In the standard literature review, generally that's kind of like a state of the research discussion. So it's not really going to go into the literature around a specific theoretical framework, but there will be a section or chapter where that framework is discussed, and that's where that literature will be pulled in and applied. Sarah, does that answer your question, or did I miss the mark on that?
No, it does. Thank you very much.
Sure. Always keeping in mind, of course, that there's an exception to every rule, but that's generally the way, the process. So here's a dissertation that is for language reading and culture, LRC. And the dissertation is titled Preparing Pre-Service Teachers for a Diverse Society, a Cosmopolitan Approach to Literacy Education Through Children's Literature. You'll see that, speaking of theoretical frameworks, this is a great example. The writer will talk about this sort of cosmopolitan model or theory around literacy education, around literacy, and applying it to using children's literature in education. So let's take a look at actually, I want to back up first to the table of contents. So here's an example of the more traditional chapter format. And I put a little comment here, note the thematic organization. So actually, you know, while chapter 3 is probably going, you know what? I am actually seeing in this, there are some sections in the review of literature that are bringing in the theory right here. So I am so sorry, Sarah, to confuse the issue. And so I'm actually glad you brought that question up, because while I do see a section about research design in chapter 3, it's actually, and context, which will go a little bit more into this sort of cosmopolitanism context. A lot of the data is methodology and a data analysis. So this then I would say is an example of where first we have an overview of various theoretical and other perspectives, educational perspectives on literacy. And sort of the author takes us through a somewhat historical overview, which we'll look at in a minute. And then goes into a shift slowly into critical literacy, which the author relates also to cosmopolitanism. I was just looking at that, so I should have remembered that the discussion of theory was in the literature review. So let's take a look now first at the overview of the dissertation, where the actual setup is theoretical framework setup is described. So this research explores a theoretical framework and praxis for a cosmopolitan-minded approach to literacy in an undergraduate children's literature course. This approach to literacy emphasizes a deeper reflective consciousness and disposition of openness to different ways of knowing, perceiving, and expressing ideas, values, and identities. So this where the author expands on cosmopolitanism and further elaborates on this cosmopolitan approach, also recognizes the power of language and story as a means of expanding consciousness and cultivating understanding amidst the complexities and diversities of our global society. So in a way, the author is going to be using a framework that fits into an increasingly global, diverse, aware, complex cultural world. And so this overview kind of sets up some of the context that's coming up. And that's why and then the rest of it kind of goes into what each chapter will focus on. The literature review then starts off with a general introduction. This literature review encompasses 5 areas of research. So these are this thematic organization. And the reason I have this note working backwards is what I say about this is that initially what the author did was a lot of research of other work that was out there, looking into both the cosmopolitanism and other theories of literacy, other approaches to literacy, and also that came out of that. And slowly, as the author reviewed literature that they found, 5 specific themes emerged. In this case, 5 areas of research related to, and the author says, my study. So again, always keeping it in the context of your particular question, research question and aims. I'm going to stop here for a second and see, are there any questions, comments? Does anyone want to add to this? Okay, feel free again to leap in at any point. So these areas or themes that are categories by which the literature review chapter will be organized are then described, okay? And so what I did was something I would do. Obviously, I did it quickly because I didn't even remember that they were talking about the theoretical framework. But what you would be doing is probably a slower scan of several dissertations in your area, and you would be looking at these kinds of structural decisions, categorical decisions, ways of organizing a discussion of the literature that you have just looked at. Okay. So these 5 areas or categories are described, and then we bounce right into the first one, a brief overview on changing perspectives of literacy. This study builds upon the many perspectives and approaches to literacy that have developed over the years. So what we see is we're going to get a little bit of a background historical overview on perspectives that the author needs to be aware of, regardless of whether they are going to draw from those perspectives or not. They still need to be aware of how those approaches and perspectives on literacy have influenced the teaching and understanding of literacy. So there's this brief overview goes through how literacy is perceived, and depending on who's talking about it, relationships among literacy and between literacy and other elements, and starts bringing up even terminology or phrases that are relevant, like interactional dimensions. In other words, how do literacy, power, and identity interact? How are they interwoven on a daily basis in this particular perspective, and so forth. Evolving recognition of the importance of literacy has sparked debate. This debate began with blah, blah. So the author backtracks to the 1960s, where where sort of this initial discussion on the importance of literacy, what literacy is, how it shows up in our lives, where this debate started, but then how it also grew. So here, the review of the literature review focuses on one source, Goody and Watt, but in an overall discussion context. In other words, this is where if people were having a discussion, one person share a perspective, and then as part of the larger debate, another perspective might come in. Here, this perspective is expanding on the previous one, further expanded on again by a third person. And then there's this sort of synthesizing again, looking at what all of these studies did, which was they focused on the divide between orality and literacy in a technical way. Here, there's the writer mentions an obvious bias toward the advantages of written over spoken text, a narrow lens, and so how this particular perspective influenced the understanding and teaching around literacy. Then another person steps into the conversation. They go back a little bit in time, but it's sort of like, okay, so that those three previous folks elaborated on this particular perspective, but I'm questioning it. I'm thinking, this is a little too narrow. Let's expand it a little bit. Let's look at language development and use among diverse speech communities, not just focusing on one particular type community or type of literacy, such as we then go into ethnographic research that was very, very important in the early and mid 80s into development, language development and literacy skills, and expanded on. So first we have, I think it was Shirley Heath, and then Gilmore and Street. And Street comes in with yet another model of literacy and is also critiquing. So do you see how this sort of debate is being exploded on the page by the writer? And that is the focus of the first part of the first area of these 5 areas, is sort of taking this walk through various understandings of literacy and slowly building up to the idea of critical literacy, and then how it then can be further brought forward with cosmopolitanism, and then going into a more focused discussion first of critical literacy and praxis in teacher education programs. So again, here, this is another part of the author's research question, is how is this used in teacher education? The author's particular case study will be an undergraduate children's literature class, but how is it used in teacher education programs? So this is, so bringing this into the context is really important. So again, I want to stop for a moment, do a quick check with y'all, and see if anyone has any questions, because we're going to move forward into an activity. We're going to take a quick, I'm going to give you a few minutes break while I set up some breakout rooms. But I want to make sure there aren't any questions floating about. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share for a moment. And what I'm going to do is I've got about 5 sample dissertations, and I'm going to set up a breakout room for each one of these and have a series of questions for you. And this is going to be something that you'll actually do individually in this case, because I want you able to look at the kind of dissertation that feels like it might be the closest, or lit review that might be the closest for what you're thinking of. So the questions are listed on this slide. And if you look in chat, David was kind enough to paste them into the chat. And then I also just dragged a PDF of this exact slide into chat. does anyone have any questions about these questions? I'm not, by the way, expecting you to take a long time with these, just about 15 minutes, just to give you a chance to look at a question and look at the document and the sections that you've identified as lit review, and make some notes. More than any, you don't have to do a lot of tons of heavy lifting. This is just dipping your toe in. All right, go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so Megan and Sophie, you each looked at, were you together in the education one? I think you're both muted.
Yes. Yeah, we both were. Mine was definitely more of a thematic one, which I think seems pretty typical for dissertations in education.
Yeah.
And maybe this is just faculty member preference, but at the end of the sections of the ones that I was reading, the writer often said, well, this is why the following section will be important. And I had done that for my dissertation proposal, and the faculty member was like, don't do that.
Right.
And then I'm seeing it littered throughout this one. Yeah,
it is
so
a
I'm
preference.
that must be just a preference. Yep. Yeah, mine was definitely thematic. It wasn't super historical by any. I mean, certainly historical references, but it didn't go in chronological order. So.
Oh no, and that's fine. Yeah. And then did you and Sophie have a chance to kind of talk together, or were you just kind of in the breakout room and didn't realize you could talk about it together?
I think we were probably both focused on our own, reading our own thing. We did not have a conversation about it.
Okay. Sophie, how did it go for you? Did the questions get you started at least kind of thinking about how to think about structuring your literature review in your dissertation?
Yeah, I think so I wrote a dissertation proposal, not dissertation project yet, but the organization wise, I think it was pretty similar with the one that I just read. So thematic, and the one thing that was interesting, because I had time to look at how she presented the finding part as well. And findings also, it was thematic, so she followed very similar organization, so that was also interesting.
It's good that you pointed that out. It also helps your readers when you can think in terms of those broader thematic or some kind of categories. It can be historical, chronological, it can be whatever categories work for the purpose of that document and your question, but it really does help your readers too. I'm going to quickly share my screen again and take you to the campus repository. So what you can do is go into it, it'll take you into UA theses and dissertations, and then you can click on just dissertations, like electronic dissertation, for instance, whatever you want. And you can also then select discipline. So for instance, in planetary science, let's see if we can find that. Planetary sciences. So Allie, this is for you. And then you've got this little gear icon over here, and you can click date descending, issue date descending, and start with the most recent dissertations, and then they move down the row. Another thing, though, that you can do is search by your advisor. So there's lots of different ways you can, pop your advisor's name in and see what comes up. I know one of the other participants was able to do that. So that way you can, or you can just look at the more recent dissertations and see who's on the committees and choose to look at examples that have the same chair or at least their advisors on the committee. And this will give you specific examples that you can apply these questions to in a more focused way for your own purposes. So I just wanted to point that out before pulling up this PowerPoint again. So again, here are the questions. So I quickly just want to take you through using a matrix to organize your sources and your notes. You'll be provided with the PDF again that has live links. So what we've got are examples of different literature review charts or matrices. They're called a bunch of different things. A video on literature review preparation, some materials on writing a literature review and using a synthesis matrix, which is a way of identifying which studies fall into which themes or categories for your lit review discussion. So the point though is I would look at several of these. And for instance, here's a literature review matrix from Walden University. So there are two different kinds. The first one is probably the one that you'll be using or starting off with. And so I'm going to pull that up. What I want you thinking about are these column headers. Your chart will only be as useful to you as the things that you take notes on for each source. So for most charts, you want to start with the source information, at least the author and date. And then often people will have a second column or include in the first column the title of the document. And you could put in all of the bibliographic stuff, document title, journal information, and DOI link, anything that links to the article. You could throw all of that into this first column if you want. And then you want to be thinking about what questions do I need to be looking at? Do implications for future research and for practice? Okay, this is related to, let's see. I think it's related to nursing. And so you might want to think about, okay, I know I'm going to be talking at some point about implications for future research or practice or both. So maybe I'll have a column for that. I will want to identify the types of studies. And so I might want to have a column that says study design or something like that. Theoretical conceptual framework. If I'm only focusing on one, then that may be irrelevant. But if I'm doing a bit of an overview or a treatment, kind of like the second sample we looked at, maybe I want to have a column that provides theoretical conceptual framework or models so that I know how to, which ones are related to which framework. Do I want a column with gaps or strengths and weaknesses or limitations? Do I want one that just says notes? Maybe my final column will be notes and so forth. And then any or all of these findings. I might want one that just is on findings. It kind of depends on what you'll be focusing on in your own research, in your own dissertation. So think about the study question that you're starting with, even if it's rough, your research question that's guiding you. And then, what do you need to make sure you pull out of each article? The other thing is that I had mentioned something about a literature review matrix or a synthesis matrix. So I want to take you there. Let me make sure I'm sharing correctly. I am. Okay, good. So, oh, that was a download, a PDF download. So here, this link also talks about what's called a synthesis matrix. This works a little differently. Once you've identified, for example, your themes or whatever it is that you want to divide your literature review, that you want to categorize it by, as you're filling out your other chart, you might find that major findings. There are several major findings that keep showing up, so those become your thematic organizers. So you would put each one of those themes or categories into the first column. The first column would be for your themes, and then you would list the various sources that fit into that theme. Another approach could be put the separate themes in the top row, and then under them just list the sources. Don't even yet go into too much detail about what each source is doing in terms of that theme. But if as you come across things, you might want to throw, like here's a quotation that the author might use, or here's a paraphrased note and where that comes from and so forth. But again, how it relates to that particular theme. So what this synthesis matrix helps you do is figure out how you want to talk about your literature within the different categories you're using to organize your literature review. So I don't want to throw too much of that at you, but that's kind of, this is another kind of matrix that can be very helpful. And your literature review chart, you might want to do, and then start highlighting, like, if a result keeps showing up, or if a type of analysis keeps showing up, or if there's something that starts becoming a common thread, highlight it so that you can so that you have a visual. And then once you go back and look at your highlighted stuff, you can start creating maybe a more thematic chart. So does that make sense? Let me throw it out to you. Do you have questions or okay? I see one thumbs up. Are the other three of you on the floor at this point, or does it make sense? Thanks, Maria. Okay, great.
Glad you went back to this because I wanted to look at it again. Implications for practice.
Practice and future research.
Yeah, I guess practice is the active research. Okay.
It's more how you would see it being applied. And so, for instance, in nursing, there's what they call pure research, where they're focusing on research studies, and then there's the clinical practice, like as a clinician, how could this research be applied in direct treating of patients, for instance, versus research doing a randomized controlled trial as a peer researcher. Does that make sense, Sally?
Yes, I guess for like that's maybe a little bit more specific to medical, so maybe I would just cut it at implications for future research.
Probably.
For planetary?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And you may find that there are some applications that are in there, but they may be more blended in planetary science. Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that question up. So I also want to mention this is just one example. If you look at the other examples, you'll see that each one of them has different headings. So it's just to give you an idea of the various ways you can categorize your notes and, help guide yourself. So make your chart as useful and personalized to you as possible. So I just wanted to go into that a little bit, and let's just do one more jam session. It's the same link. David, would you be okay with popping that link in to the chat again? Just take a minute to go into the Jamboard. Let me see if I can pull that up again. Remembering too that all of this can get changed up. You're in it, you're in the process. So great. So while we're looking at this screen, do y'all want to just talk a little bit about why you chose, to start off, what your reasoning is for making these initial choices? How about on this first one, the thematic categorizing. So I see pick superiority theory, Gestalt principles, and cognitive load theory. So,
right.
Okay, so is this like 3 theoretical frameworks?
Correct, that they would all tie in together into the argument that there are visual forms of perception that are humanly innate, regardless of culture.
Okay, so for a synthesis matrix, you might actually like to organize, the categories for organizing your lit review. The lit review might be discussions of these different theoretical frameworks. For your initial lit review chart,
you
could have one column that's called theoretical framework / model, and then indicate which of these theories that particular article is working from.
Right. Okay.
Good. That's great. So, Allison, Megan, and Sophie, how about y'all?
I was actually starting to make my own review matrix while you're showing us. And I first put themes because literature review usually have different sub categories or sub headings. So I was thinking maybe I need to make different sub pages, but then I thought maybe just putting them all together in one page and put different name of the themes might be better because sometimes they overlap with each other. So I put that. And for me, theoretical framework and findings, I thought they would be the most important, but I would also put author date, other information as well.
Yeah, that would be pretty much everyone's first column would be the author and the date. Very good. And so you've got, in a sense here too, you've got 2 different potentials. So theoretical framework, findings, those could be 2 columns on this sort of more standard literature review table or chart like this one. Oops, I don't know if I'm sharing that. I'm not. Like this one. So this is the kind of headings, kind of section headings here. So like here, theoretical conceptual framework could be one column heading, and then you could identify the framework or frameworks for each source. In the synthesis matrix, this is where you might have identified your specific themes, and then out of what you noticed in this literature review grid. So this is like what you start with, and this is where you start pulling it together into the ways you'll organize your lit review. So you're doing a nice job of thinking in those two ways. And then I see some good stuff here. Methods, sources, of course, here like author date and whatever. And again, if you want, for say your author date, you could also include, I would throw in at least the DOI link, so you have a direct link to the source. Go ahead, Megan.
Yeah, the source for me is actually the source that the research is based on, because that's helpful for me to keep a record of, if it's like a source that I want to go back to and maybe use my research on that.
Gotcha. I
also added in mine the citation so that I didn't have to go back and find it
exactly
in the format that you needed in. And
the
one thing that was really helpful for me too was using the librarian. We have an education librarian.
Oh, yes.
Across all the colleges, but ours for education was super helpful for me in identifying a lot of great articles and things.
Excellent.
Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned that, Megan, because for instance, the College of Nursing has a librarian. We have a librarian liaison. Same thing. She can help people with literature search, setting up their literature searches. Even if your college doesn't have a specific librarian with an office, whose office there, the main library, all of the librarians in the library system for our campus have disciplines. So you will see that for your discipline, there will be someone listed, a librarian listed. So finding out who that person is and reaching out to them sooner rather than later, is a great idea. Megan, thank you for bringing that up. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Megan. Megan just posted the link to finding out your librarian. That's a fabulous resource. I will add that actually to the PowerPoint resources. So nicely done. You all did a great job. And so to this list of resources, I'll add the finding your librarian. So these are just kind of odds and ends of things, ways to structure your dissertation, write literature reviews, and some you might find useful, some not. But they could be helpful. There's several others that I'll also let you know. There are resources for you to use, and I'll put them in chat. There's the Writing Skills Improvement Program, wsip.arizona.edu. What is the think tank? It's the Writing Center, Think Tank Writing Center, but I don't. WSIP is easy to remember, but you might have to do a search for Think Tank Writing Center on the U of A main homepage. And then the Graduate Center, which is where David is stationed. All three of these places have individual coaching, drop-in coaching, and small group coaching. So there are great resources as you're working through your process, and these folks can act as mentors for you. As my 6:30 alarm going